Cool. Hi everyone. So I hope you're ready for some maths. It's gonna be, I think it's gonna be fun. I find this really fun. But yeah, it's gonna be pretty hardcore. So just to give you a bit more background about me. So I was technical manager at Opera North for 7 years. And then became the sustainability champion at Opera North, but in 2017. In 2018, I started Sail. And then just from there, after starting Sail and becoming the sustainability champion at Opera North, through my work there, we won Best Newcomer at the Creative Green Awards in 2019. Sail became a company in 2020, and then in December of last year, I left Opera North completely to go and dedicate all of my time to Sail. And I'm currently studying for a IEMA certificate in environmental management as well. So about Sail. We're a not-for-profit that helps the creative and cultural industries within the Leeds City region to be more sustainable. And we do that through various different things, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is kind of who we are. So we have over 250, 300 members now, I think. Lots of organizations, a really good kind of cross-sector of the creative and cultural sector. So we've got like the big film and TV companies like ITV, Channel 4, the big arts organizations in the cities, theatres. We've got the Leeds City of Culture, which is going on at the moment, and we're their sustainability partners as well. So we're really, really good kind of cross-section of the sector. And we do this. So we do workshops like this one. We run training courses. So we've been doing carbon literacy training pretty much since we started. And we do like specific consultancy work. So we work with whoever needs our help to help them be more sustainable in their practice by recommending different things that they can do. So cutting down on energy, we do like energy intelligence surveys and all kinds of fun stuff. And yeah, we just help. We do whatever the creative and cultural sector needs to reduce its carbon footprint. So onto carbon footprints themselves. What are they and what are they for? So this is kind of the dictionary definition of a carbon footprint. So it's the total greenhouse gas emissions caused by an individual, event, organization, service, place, or product expressed as a carbon dioxide equivalent. So what that means is every sort of thing that you do, in effect, like any product that is made, any service that is rendered, will have what is called a carbon dioxide equivalent. So, for example, if you are driving in a car and you are burning petrol, that will give off fumes, and you then kind of you relate that back to carbon dioxide. So, for example, methane has a global warming potential of something like 4, I think. It's something around the 4 mark. So it means for every 1 kilogram of methane that you release as a result of your actions, it's the equivalent of 4 kilograms worth of carbon dioxide. So that you always relate everything back to carbon dioxide, which has a global warming potential of 1. So it's how you kind of how you quantify all of these different greenhouse gases, because they all have different global warming potentials. So this is what we're essentially going to do. We're going to relate everything back to a carbon dioxide equivalent, and that is what your carbon footprint becomes. So the pros of carbon footprinting: raises awareness is the first one. So if you understand the carbon footprint, or you understand your actions and kind of how it is releasing carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, then if you're aware of it, you can take action on it. It's good for accountability as well. It's good for reporting to other people what you're doing. It's good for incentivizing change. So, for example, you could introduce things like carbon pricing. Not saying that you should do that, but it's a potential thing that you could do. And then it also, and this is the key thing really, is it identifies areas for improvement. So if you understand what your kind of carbon footprint is, it allows you to know where you're going to have the most impact. So, for example, when I worked at Opera North, the first thing we did was we have to tackle waste. Waste is obviously going to be our biggest carbon footprint. It wasn't until we actually started calculating our carbon footprint that we found that actually the biggest impact was audience travel. So we'd spent all of our time and effort focusing on waste, and we'd completely ignored the audience travel, which was by far the biggest carbon impact. So this is really what it's good for, is just knowing where you can take action. It does have its downsides for carbon footprinting, so it's not a perfect process by any means. As we will see today, it is complicated. It is a very, very complex thing to do, because you have to take into account a lot of different factors, and it does feel at times like you're trying to compare apples to oranges. So it is quite difficult. It can be quite expensive to do as well, especially like some of the stuff that you need to be able to calculate your carbon footprint ends up being trapped behind paywalls sometime. So one of the things I'm going to share with you today is the CIBSE TM46 guidance, which I'm going to give you, but you're supposed to pay for that, but I'm going to give you it. Other things is like incomplete data as well. So some stuff is impossible to measure it, because realistically speaking, the only way you could get a truly 100% accurate carbon footprint is if you were to somehow capture all of the carbon as the result of whatever it is that you're doing, and then capture it all and then weigh it or something. But you physically can't do that. It's impossible. So it is always a bit of a educated guess, and it's a bit of a kind of, you're using your best judgment to figure out what it is, but often the data that you need doesn't exist. And as we'll see today, you have to make slight adjustments and assumptions, which, yeah, it just means that it's always going to be incomplete. It's always going to be slightly inaccurate. And then also the other real downside to carbon footprinting is it pushes the onus onto individuals, which is not fair, actually. And it's actually the real need for the way that we're going to achieve a net zero society is by systemic change, by systems change, behavioral change, and societal change. Pushing it onto individuals is a really unfair thing to do. So just bear this in mind as we go through this process. It is not a perfect process. It's not without its downsides, but it does have some upsides in that it allows you to sort of to understand what your impact might be and where you might be able to take the most action. So onto the tools that we're going to use. So the main one we're going to use today is the top one here. So this is the greenhouse gas reporting figures from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We're also going to use the WWF Biogenic carbon calculator, and we're going to use the CIBSE energy benchmarking tool as well, and the TM46 guidance. You don't need to worry about this too much just yet, because as we come to them, I'm going to explain what each of them are, what they're used for, and that kind of thing. But the main thing we're going to use is this greenhouse gas reporting figures. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what they are. So the UK government publish these figures every year, and they are specifically for carbon accounting. So they're usually for corporate businesses to be able to report on their carbon footprint for kind of, because some have to do it legally as part of, it's called the Streamlined Energy Reporting Calculation or something. It's SECR, which replaced a different thing that they had to do a few years ago. But effectively, it's a spreadsheet full of numbers, which I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you what all of these numbers are. And every year they get released, like new ones get released. And it was by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which as of about 2 weeks ago no longer exists. It's now been replaced with the Department for Business and, what is it called? The Department for Business, Energy and Net Zero or something. I think we're calling it BESNES rather than BEIS. But yeah, so the updated factors are getting released every year. And then there's two sets as well. So there's the condensed set, which is okay for kind of most people. But there's the full set for advanced users. And that's the one we're going to be using, which is very exciting. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what this spreadsheet looks like, and I'll post a link in the chat as well so you can all kind of have a look at it. So this is it effectively. So at the bottom here you have a load of tabs for loads and loads and loads of different things. So if we look onto fuels, if we were to, for example, if we were to burn 1 ton of natural gas, just for a laugh, then the carbon footprint would be what's that, 2,539.25 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent. So effectively, we were to take 1 ton of natural gas, set fire to it, and just release a load of carbon. That's how much carbon roughly would be released according to these conversion figures. And they've got conversion figures for everything. So, well, nearly everything, not absolutely everything, but nearly everything. So got all of the different fuels like aviation fuel, lubricants, naphtha, waste oils, all this kind of thing. Bioenergy as well. So got like biodiesel, HVO, burning wood chips and wood pellets. All the different F gases as well, and CFCs, different vehicles, delivery vehicles, and then we've got things like the welter tank, bioenergy, loads and loads of different things. But as I said, as we kind of go through, when we start looking at the first case study, I'll show you where to find the relevant kind of the relevant factor. How are we doing so far? You still with me? We're going to go breakneck pace. All good. Cool. Right. So that is that, which is the greenhouse gas conversion figures. So what I'm going to talk about now is scopes as well. So as well as having the kind of the concept of a carbon footprint, which is trying to capture the entire carbon footprint relating to a product, you have to also think of different scopes, which are like a way of framing what is within and without your direct control. So Scope 1 emissions are things that you have direct control over. So what this means is if, let's say in your personal life, this is gas that you would burn in your boiler, for example, to heat your home if you have a gas boiler, because you're burning the methane. As you burn the methane, it releases carbon dioxide, and you're directly doing it. Similarly, in your car, if you've got a petrol, diesel, hybrid car, you are directly burning the fuel in that car and releasing the carbon dioxide and the other gases, the other greenhouse gases. So again, it's directly in your control. So it's a Scope 1 impact. Scope 2 is it's basically it's electricity, and that is because you don't own the power plant, obviously. And so whoever owns the power plant, it's in their Scope 1. It's not yours, it's theirs. However, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing if you weren't demanding it. So for example, the UK's energy fuel mix it's roughly around 30% natural gas, and so there is renewables in the national grid, like there's solar and hydro and quite a lot of wind as well, but there is still natural gas, there's still coal and that kind of thing. But like I said, that you're not responsible for the fact that, well, you're not in control of the fact that these gas power plants are burning gas for electricity, but they wouldn't be doing it if you didn't need it. So that's why it's in your Scope 2. It's an indirect impact. And then Scope 3 is everything else, which is where it gets really tricky. And Scope 3 is essentially everything relating to your supply chain. So it's how you get things to you. It's things like the welter tank, which is a concept I'll talk about in a little bit, which is like how you get fuel from wherever it is to you for you to then use it. It's things like so for like theatre and stuff, it's audience travel, like I mentioned before, because that's, again, the organisation is not in direct control of that. They don't own the vehicles that people come to their shows in. So it's, again, a Scope 3 impact. For products, it's things like the materials would be in Scope 3, because you have no control how those materials were made or processed or anything like that. You've just bought them and put them into your thing. So again, that's in Scope 3. So the other thing with Scope 3 impacts as well is it's basically where the majority of your emissions will be lying. It's around, I think, about 80% or something. It's a massive amount will be lying in your Scope 3. So the thing, and this is also just something to be aware of, is companies will often use this to their advantage to claim carbon neutrality when it's not true. So, for example, Google, they have claimed that they've been net zero carbon since 2007. In the small print, it says Scope 1 and 2 only. So they've essentially ignored their entire supply chain. So they've got all of these servers that are, really power hungry, but they've ignored the fact that, somebody else has made all of these servers and shipped them to them and all of this kind of thing. They're just saying, basically, for our electricity and gas, we've offset it, which is, it's just kind of lying. So it's just worth, just be wary of scope 3. It's where the majority of your emissions will be, and it's also the thing that it's hard to quantify it, and people will lie about it effectively. Any questions on this so far, by the way? We're all good. Smash in or crack on. So how do you actually quantify what is the carbon footprint of a product? Now, luckily, there's actually some really good guidance on this, and it's called the Product Lifecycle Accounting and Reporting Standard from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So it is a kind of worldwide recognized system for calculating the carbon impact associated with products. So this is what it says essentially. So this little diagram here, you've got these two things: the material acquisition and material processing, what are known as upstream emissions. So it's emissions that happen before you have anything to do with it, essentially. So it's things like, let's say if the product is made out of wood, it's the carbon impact of felling the trees, processing the wood, shipping it to wherever it is that you buy it from. It's things like, so for example, looking at making wool thread, it would be the carbon impact of getting the wool from the farm, processing it, making it into a yarn, transporting it to the shop where it's going to be sold for you to collect, and that kind of thing. So you've got all of these upstream emissions that happen before you have anything to do with it, essentially. So that's what those two green things are: material acquisition, material processing, upstream emissions. Then you have your widget production, which is basically your scope 1 and 2 impacts. So it's any gas and electricity that you use to create your products. And then you've got your downstream emissions, which is once you've created your product, then what happens to it? Where does it go? So you have your distribution to think about, and well, you have storage and distribution to think about. So where is your product going to go before it gets sold on to the end consumer? Is it going to stay in your house? Is it going to go to a massive warehouse? Are you going to use Amazon fulfillment, or what is it you're going to do with it? Then you've got the use of the product as well. So for example, I don't know, if you you make a product which is just, it relies on you filling it full of butane, and then the person has to light the butane, then that's going to be giving off carbon emissions every time people use it. So you've got that to think about. And then you've also got to think about what happens to it at the very end, like what happens to the product when you're not using it anymore. And because some things, when you put them into landfill, they break down. When they break down, they release methane. It's also how are you going to get it to the place where it's going to be like it's going to be dealt with. Are you going to just chuck it into your general recycling? Are you going to chuck it into your black bin? Is it going to get burned? Like what's going to happen to it afterwards? So when you kind of think about all of those things, the acquisition, the processing, the production of the product itself, storage and distribution, use and disposal, that gives you a really good framework to be like, right, I'm going to use that to calculate my carbon footprint. Those are the boundaries I'm going to be working within. It's quite complicated. Yeah, go away, Siri. It's always trying to talk to me. Anyway, so we're going to each one in a little bit more detail. Oh, got something in the chat. So it's a really good question, Amy, actually, and it's, as we get into calculating the product, we will cover that in a bit more detail. But effectively, the greenhouse gas reporting figures that are on the spreadsheet I showed you before, they have done a lot of that calculation of all of that upstream processing. So you don't really have to think about it because it's already embedded within that figure. But if you know more, like if you like, actually, I know better than that figure, I can go one step further, then you can do your own kind of research and come up with your own number and then slot that in instead. It'll make a lot more sense once I get onto the calculation bit, though, because I'll show you, because that's what I'm going to do with the biogenic carbon calculator, because the greenhouse gas reporting figures have one figure, but I'm going to show you how to get an even more accurate one, which is quite cool. But really good question, though. So onto, yeah, so for materials acquisition and processing, what emissions are we going to have under each scope? So we are going to have any petrol and diesel from own vehicles for going to get the materials and products. So if you have to drive in your car to a shop, you're going to have the greenhouse gas emissions of doing that. So you need to be logging your mileage. as effectively you need to log how many miles have I gone in that vehicle from my place of work to wherever the materials are. Or in the scope 3 is, did somebody send them to me? So for example, if you use DPD or whatever to send you materials, then again, it's not in your scope 1 because you don't own the van that DPD use, but they wouldn't be sending it if it wasn't for your demand. So again, it's in your scope 3. So scope 1 for materials acquisition and processing, like I said, it's petrol and diesel for any owned vehicles. It's also gas used in processing if applicable. I don't know if you like, I don't know what that might be, but if there is any gas that you're using in the acquisition of a product, it would be there, or processing of a product, it would be there. Scope 2 will be any electricity used in the processing. And then scope 3, it's the emissions from the extraction and production of the raw materials used in the products. And then transportation and distribution of materials if you're not going to get it yourself. If you're using a third party to get products and materials to you, that's where it would be. And like I said, the greenhouse conversion factors from BEIS, they already have all of this baked in. So you don't really need to worry too much. You just need to calculate, okay, so I bought this bit of material that I'm putting into my product from this place. So I need to calculate what that mileage is and then remember what the method of travel was effectively. And then the same with the material as well. So you would take a number, like a weight of the material, and go, okay, I need to remember that I bought, let's say, 2 kilograms of wood from this place, and just make a note of that. Another question. Where does use of solar PV energy fit in? That comes down to, that's kind of later on. It depends on where in the chain it is. And so, for example, if it's upstream or downstream, it doesn't really factor in, because everything's kind of it's about averages. So with the greenhouse gas conversion figures, you're given effectively what is a carbon footprint per kilowatt hour. So it does, and that is assuming that you're going to get the power from the national grid. So really, let's say if you've got solar PV in your house or in your place of work where you're making your products, then you can, tell you what, I'll come back to that, because when I actually get into that slide, it'll make more sense, because I'm jumping around a little bit, but it is a very, very good question. I promise I'll come back to it. So let's get through. Scope 3 value less at scope 1. In a way, yes. Like people try and hide things in scope 3 a little bit, and it's a very difficult thing to kind of in some ways wrap your head around, and also you can tie yourself up in knots, kind of thinking, well, oh, I need to include that and that and that, and that's why people sometimes are just like, you know what, I'm just going to ignore scope 3 because it's too hard. But it is where you're kind of your biggest emissions are, so it's something you do have to contend with it, and you do have to think about it, because it's otherwise it's been a bit disingenuous if you don't include it. But it is weird that people, they don't really, I don't know, it's not assigned the same importance in some way, even though it is really important, and it's because it is kind of outside of your direct control as well. It's a very odd one, scope 3. But anyway, moving on slightly. So like I said, that's all of the materials acquisition and processing potential impacts under every single scope. For production, so this is the kind of the scope, the environmental impact or the carbon impact of producing different materials. So in scope 1, it's any gas usage you use for creating the product or fuel used during the production of the product. So this could be gas heating in your workshop. It could be things like if you're doing I don't know, actually, no, it wouldn't be that. So scope 2 would be electricity usage resulting from creating the products. That'd be things like lighting in your workshop. Welding, if you do any sort of welding for your products or anything like that, then obviously using electricity for that. If you're using like pillar drills or anything like that, any time you're using electricity relating to the creation of the product, then that's in your scope 2. And then scope 3 would be things like any waste that you've generated as a result of the production of the product. So if you've got any offcuts of fabric or wood or whatever, that you have to deal with that somehow. So you have to kind of effectively weigh that and then know what you're going to do with it. And it would also be things like water usage as well. So if you have to use any water for any kind of your production process, that would be in your scope 3 when it comes to production as well. Any questions? Because I know I'm going quite quick, and it's pretty hardcore. All good. Cool. Yeah, so we got materials and acquisition, we got production. Then we move on to what happens afterwards. So we'll look at kind of storage and distribution. So for storage and distribution, the scope 1 impacts could be if you do the deliveries yourself. So if you were to take it out to the consumer, then that would be in your scope 1. It would be gas usage in the storage warehouse only if you own it. If you don't own it, then it goes into scope 3. So it's just worth bearing in mind, if you own the warehouse, then yeah, it's in your scope 1. But if you don't own it, then it's in your scope 3. Scope 2 would be electricity used for storage. Again, if you own a warehouse or if you store things in your home before you send them on. And then scope 3 would be like external delivery company mileage, website impact. If you're selling on an online store, you could theoretically say that that's in your scope 3 as well. So yeah, that's it for distribution and storage. And then for disposal, again, scope 1 would be if you are disposing of the material yourself, then that would be in your scope 1 or 2. But because if you use like a petrol or diesel car to do that, then that's in your scope 1. If for some reason you decided to burn it to get rid of it, then that would be in your scope 1. Scope 2 would be any electricity used to get rid of the product. And then scope 3 would be emissions from production, transportation, and materials used in the disposal process. So this means things like landfill liners and cover materials, and emissions from the decomposition of organic material in landfill. But again, this is all factored into the BEIS, the GHG conversion factors. So you don't need to worry too much. You just need to know that that's what it means. You don't really need to worry too much about what the numbers are, because it's all baked in. So this is how you kind of get all of this data as well. So you can get it from recording mileage, and I would recommend, like, if you are serious about calculating the carbon footprint of a product, just try and record all of the miles that you've traveled for different reasons, and just put a note as to why you did it, because it will help you later on if you are trying to calculate the carbon footprint. It's much easier to do it at the kind of point of you gathering all this data rather than trying to do it all later on. Also, things like meter readings. So one way you can try and calculate the carbon footprint of like a product creation, for example, is reading your meter before you do something and then do it again afterwards, and then see what the difference is. And that will give you a number in kilowatt hours, and then just log that down and say, when I was making this is what my this is what my meter said it went up by for electricity and for gas. So it's really useful. If you don't do that, then you can look at your energy bills as well, because they come back with a usage figure, and you can do a really quick and dirty calculation and say, okay, well, I know that I used this much electricity this month. I know I was in my workshop on this day, so I'll just divide this amount per month by the amount of days that we've got, and then divide that by 24 hours, and then times it by however long I was in the workshop. And that'll give you a really quick and dirty, like, okay, for the amount of hours, it's roughly this in kilowatt hours. It's not the best way of doing it, but that's a way you can do it. You can look at your smart meter readings as well. So like on Octopus, I know you can log in and you can look at your kind of day profile, and it will show you how much electricity you've used in half-hour increments. So then you can say, well, I know I was in my workshop working between this time and this time, and there's the usage. So then you can get it directly from their web console, which is quite cool. There's also half-hourly meter readings, but this again is for big users. Like if you're using a lot of energy, you will have a half-hourly meter, and you can ask your meter point operator for the readings. But like I said, this is if you own like a massive warehouse or a massive theatre or something. Building management systems are very similar. If you own a very, very big building, then you could look at potentially from the building management system, there might be sub-meters or something on it, which you can get readings from. And then if all else fails, like if you don't have meter readings, bills, anything like that, you can use benchmarking, but it is very quick and dirty and not super accurate. So this is what I was talking, the CIBSE benchmarks, which we're going to use in a little bit when I actually get to the calculation section. Yeah, they're not great. And they're a bit out of date because the last time the benchmarks I think were updated was 2008. So they're about 14 years out of date now, or 15 years out of date. So they're not great, but that's, yeah, your last resort. If you really don't have any other information, you can use benchmarks. So on scope 3, how you get this data, a lot of it is due to weight. So weighing things and understanding how much they weigh is the only kind of way to get something which you can then derive a carbon footprint figure from, because the greenhouse gas reporting figures, they often go by weight. They go by kilograms or like tons, or usually tons. So weigh everything. Getting data from suppliers as well. Like if you've ordered things from them, ask if they've got a carbon footprint figure, brilliant. Like just get that from them. If they don't, try and get weight data or anything like that from them. Again, benchmarks are quite useful. You can get certain benchmarks for certain products. Some people do put it on their websites as well. So you can get it from there. And then mileage figures as well. So if you know, for example, again, saying DPD, I know that they transported my product from this postcode to this postcode, you can type that into Google Maps. It'll give you a mileage figure, and then you can use that to calculate your scope 3 for your delivery, for example. So little question there. What if your rent space and fuel is included? So a very good question. If you don't have access to your meter or anything like that, I mean, first of all, try and ask your landlord, and just ask your landlord, what do you know how much electricity I used? I'm trying to calculate my carbon footprint. Can you tell me how much electricity and gas I used during this period? If you rent a bit of an area, ask them what the bit for the full building was, and then just work out what your bit of the building is, and then sort of just divide it by that, if that makes sense. So let's say if you know that the building is 80 meters squared, and then you know that your bit is 10 meters squared, and then you just divide it by 8, and that'll give you a figure. It's quick and dirty. It's not super accurate, but it gives you something. So yeah, I'd say just ask your landlord and see what they've got. And if they've got nothing, then you'll have to just use a benchmark. Yeah, it wouldn't be realistic. It wouldn't at all. But unfortunately, if there's no other way of doing it, then that's just what you have to work with. And then make a note of that in your calculation, and then say, you know, I want to get better than this. So you can look at things like these things called cable clamps. So like, for example, for your electricity meter reading, you could theoretically go up to your distribution board, and then you get a clamp which you attach to the sort of electricity feed to you. And yeah, it's tricky. But there's one there. What's about rent an electrician, work out what the electricity was for the room? Yeah, that's another way as well, and I think that's probably how they will have done it with a cable clamp, and like attach it to the distribution board, and then from there it literally just does like an automated reading. Or you could flip it the other way round, and if you know all of the devices that you're using, you could then calculate how much electricity you think each device is going to use during a certain period, and do it the other way around. There's ways of doing it, but yeah, it's not going to be super accurate. But at least you know that, and you know you can put it in your notes for your calculation and say, actually, you know, this is not as accurate as I want it to be. So the next time I'll do my carbon footprint calculation, I'll try and make it more accurate. If you work from home, the house is already reheated for living purposes. Do you ignore the heating for work purposes? That is entirely down to you. It's up to you whether you want to include that or not. This is the other thing. Like, there's no hard or fast rules. So it's up to you and kind of what you feel comfortable doing, because there's obviously a tendency to try and get it down as low as possible, and it's also what are you doing the carbon footprint for? Like, is it to explain, to try and communicate this to external people and say, I've calculated the carbon footprint and I think it's this, or is it for yourself internally to understand where you're going to try and make reductions? So if you're trying to communicate it externally, then you're like, well, okay, am I bothered about making the distinction between work and home heating? Do I just include both, or do I include neither because it's not really relevant? Or like, if you're doing it for internal, you're like, actually, I really want to know what the impact is, so therefore I am going to include it. But there's no hard or fast rules. It's totally down to you, which again probably doesn't help. But these are really good questions. Do keep them coming. So right, we're gonna actually calculate now. We're gonna do some maths. So this is what the first one we're going to try and calculate, and we're going to do it live. This is I think Joe's in the room actually, somewhere. I'm sure I saw the name. Or maybe not. But anyway, doesn't matter. Oh, hello, hiya.
Thank you very much.
It's all right.
This is going to be interesting. Thank you.
It's okay. So this is what we're trying to calculate the carbon footprint of. So it's the small 3D sculptural artwork, 23 centimeters by 23 centimeters, made of fruit cage netting, wool felt, cotton threads. It's also got a pine frame and a kind of wooden backing board as well. So we're going to try and calculate this as best we can. So starting off, we're going to look at the materials and acquisition. So Joe told me it was 62 miles to a 62-mile round trip to go and get the materials, or at least some of the materials. But for the purposes of this, we'll just assume that you got everything in one trip, even though you probably did multiple to different places. But just for now, we'll just assume it's this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a link to my calculator spreadsheet. So if you want to do it along with me, you can. So 1 second. So anyone with the link, apply. Copy that. Where's Zoom? There you are. Okay. So there we go. So this is just a link to the spreadsheet that I'm going to be filling in as we go along. And then I've also got the greenhouse gas conversion figures here. Which again I will share with you. 1 second, copy. There we go. So there's the conversion figures. So we will start with if I share my screen and go to this one. Right, so we're looking at 62 miles. Joe, what type of car do you have?
Peugeot.
Is it a big or a small one?
Smallish.
Smallish. Is it diesel or petrol?
Petrol,
cool. So we're looking here along the bottom. So we want passenger vehicles. We want a mini petrol vehicle. So we have the total kilograms CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalent, is 0.13421. So it's 0.13421. So I'm just going to copy that. And then I'm going to move it over to this spreadsheet. So we're going to say the type is, we'll call it travel. Oh, I didn't stop. Sorry, I swapped spreadsheets, but then didn't swap what I was sharing. There we go. So here we go. So the type is travel, and it's a 62-mile round trip to collect materials. The amount was 62 miles. The unit, sorry, miles. So we've got amount 62, unit miles. Greenhouse gas conversion factor, which I've just copied from the spreadsheet, is, there we go, 0.312, look, that. So what I want to do is calculate that by that. There we go. So 8 kilograms CO2e. There we go. You're following me so far, everyone. Because it is just a case of like, yeah, getting the number and then calculating the factor. And I got the factor from the spreadsheet by getting a super mini petrol vehicle and saying how many kilograms CO2e per mile. Oh, hang on. Did I just do kilometers? Did I do the wrong one? I did. Sorry, hang on. I do this all the time. You have to like double, triple check that you've selected the right thing. Hang on. So if I go back to the greenhouse gas conversion figures, you see here, mini, it's kilometers and then miles, and it was miles. So I used the wrong conversion figure. My bad. So back to here. So just update this one to be that new conversion factor. There we go. So 13 kilograms CO2e. Okay, sorry, it's gone up, Joe.
It has, yeah, quite considerably.
No problem. So if you wanted, I mean, I've got this extra thing because I use this calculator quite a lot, and I use it for calculating the carbon footprint of like events. So I've got a little column here for tons CO2e. I don't think we're going to need that today. I don't think we're going to end up in tons carbon dioxide equivalent territory. And then for the scope, it's a scope 1 impact. And that's because it is it's petrol, diesel, it's a direct emission. So we'll put that as a scope 1 impact. So it's deleted my if statements, never mind. But yeah, so that's the first one. We are done on that one. So on to the next, which is, so I'm doing a lot of jumping around between different presentations and stuff. You have to bear with me. But once we've done the first one, we'll be flying. So back to this one. So we've done that. Travel to collect material, 62 miles round return. Scope 3, we've got the well to tank. So well to tank is, as I mentioned earlier, it is the carbon impact of getting fuel from the refinery, or well, drilling for it and getting it onto land, transporting it to a petrol forecourt for you. So if you're calculating your scope 1 emissions, it's best practice to calculate your well to tank emissions as well. For scope 3 emissions, so for example, you don't really need to calculate, like, again, if DPD send a van to you, you don't really need to calculate the well to tank. But if it's for you, if it's a scope 1 emission, you do. It's best practice to do it. In general, does delivery work out better than driving? Yes, sort of. Yeah, it depends on the distance, but you benefit from economies of scale. So typically, and like things like some like DHL, they have electric vans, for example. So it's sometimes depending on the supplier, it's better as well. So yeah, typically, but not always. There's always a bit of nuance. So the other elements, we've got the scrap waste, wool felt, threads, backing board, and frame, which is going to be really hard to get those because there's not really a proper greenhouse gas conversion factor for any of them except the frame. So we'll look at scrap waste, wool felt, threads, backing board, and frame. Cool. So we'll jump back into the greenhouse gas conversion figures and try and find something that fits. So here we are. So we want to go over to this one for materials. Material use. Here we go. So it says here, materials should be used to report on consumption of procured materials based on their origin. So whether they are a primary material or recycled material. The thing is, it doesn't include every single one because it can't possibly do that. So you have to try and pick something that's in the ballpark. And then if you do get in touch with the supplier though and go, I want to try and work out what the carbon footprint of this is, could you tell me, like, do you know? They might be able to give you a more accurate figure. But if you're just trying to get a rough finger in the air kind of guess as to what the carbon footprint might be, just try and get the closest thing. So I'd say for scrap, for kind of felt, your closest thing, and this sounds a bit ridiculous, it might be clothing, it might be reused clothing is possibly the closest thing, and that's 152.25 kilograms CO2e per ton. So that's all right. So we'll kind of say it's roughly that. For wool felt, we'll probably say it's the same thing because I can't see anything closer. And threads. Backing board, there is one that's actually close for that, which is here, paper and board. Joe, would you say it was recycled or would you say it was a primary material?
The backing board?
Yeah.
It's foam, but it's a recycled foam.
Cool. We'll
yeah.
say but that's more plastic then, I guess.
Yeah. And the waste, Jamie, I'm getting a bit confused because I'm mixing waste, which is plastic, scaffolding netting, garden netting, fruit cage netting, with 100% organic wool felt. So you've got two different materials going there. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the thing. It's really difficult to get an exact number for all of those things. So you've just got to get what is potentially the closest thing. So that's what I'm saying. Clothing, because it's kind of close, but like I say, if you get a more accurate figure, then by all means plug that in.
Yeah.
But for this at the moment, this is the closest we're probably going to get with the available data set we have. And this is where I was saying, like, one of the cons of carbon footprinting is this is where it starts to fall down, is when you're like, there's this very specific thing, but I have no data to back it up. So you've got to kind of do it in the best possible way, which is, try and relate it to the closest possible thing. So for the backing board, we'll say roughly a recycled rigid plastic. I think is probably the closest. So that's 2748.83. And that's again per ton, isn't it? Yeah, that's per ton of plastic. Yeah, plastic production, massive, massive carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And then the frame, that's wood. So we will say the frame, where's wood gone? Where are you? I just had it. Plastics, paper and board. I literally just, oh, there it is, wood. So per ton of wood, and we'll say reused or recycled, which do you reckon?
I think it's reused.
Brilliant. That's the lower one. So let's go with that.
Good.
Perfect. Cool. So we got those conversion figures. I've just wrote them down here, just because, so I don't have to jump between different spreadsheets. So we'll share the calculator again. Here we go. Right. So we had the scrap waste, the wool, felt, and threads, which we are roughly going to say is the clothing factor, but it's actually not. So we'll put that as materials. So we'll say scrap waste, wool, felt, and threads. What weight would you say that was?
Oh, crikey. It's quite light, so
half a kilogram.
Sorry, what did you say?
Maybe half a kilogram.
That's just what I was going to say. Yeah.
So we've got 0.5 of a kilogram, and now the issue we've got here is the greenhouse gas conversion figure is tons carbon dioxide. So we have to divide the greenhouse gas conversion figure, but basically put this into tons, because that's what the factor is expecting. So it's 152.25 kilograms CO2e per ton. Oh, yeah, that's right. So we want to say 0.5 kilograms would be 0.005 tons. Does that make sense? Because we're talking about kilograms, but the conversion factor is in tons. So then you have to divide that by 1,000 to get to 0.005. Oh, actually, I've missed a naught off. Should be even one more, I think. So we then times U by U. There we go. 0.076 kilograms CO2e. Again, it's very rough because it has to be, because we don't have those exact figures. Next one, backing board. So that's materials again. Backing board. Do you have a rough weight?
Oh gosh, I can't remember. It's practically nothing.
One. We'll go for 10 grams.
Right.
Why not? So the conversion factor for that, 2,748.83. And there we go. So that's that, 0.27. And then we've got the frame, which is materials again. Frame. We'll say the frame, probably half a kilogram again.
Yeah.
Vaguely. Then we've got 38.54. Great. There we go. So we're at 13 kilograms CO2e so far. Again, heavy caveat, it is not super accurate because it can't possibly be. So don't hold me to it. Any questions so far before we carry on?
No. Makes sense.
All good?
Yeah.
Cool. Right, let's plow on. So we're on to production now. So you told me, Joe, during the production that you use 0.3 kilowatt hours of gas, which was I think the heating for your studio.
Yeah.
And then the electricity you said you use for your overlocker and all of that kind of thing. This is a very, very easy one to calculate, which is brilliant. So 0.3 kilowatt hours of gas, and then 1.905 kilowatt hours of electricity. Very, very, very easy to calculate this one, luckily, because it's already in the format that the greenhouse gas conversion factors expect, essentially. So we go here, and then over here we have. Oh, you know what? I missed off the bloody well to tank, didn't I? After all of that stuff saying don't miss off the well to tank, I went and missed it off. So I'll come back to that. Here we go. UK electricity. So for all UK electricity in 2022, the 2023 figures haven't been released yet. So that's why there isn't anything more accurate. It's saying per kilowatt hour, it's 0.19338 per kilogram CO2e per kilowatt hour. So if we were to say you've used 1.905, go back to here. So we say, right, energy usage, and it's so it was for overlocker, wasn't it?
And the heat press.
Yeah.
Yep.
And heat press.
Yep.
So then we say it's 1.905 in kilowatt hours. The conversion factor is that. And there we go. So that's that one. And then gas. That was gas for, was it heating?
Yes.
Brilliant. Heating. Then we've got 0.3 kilowatt hours for that. And this is one thing to note, by the way, on your meters, your gas usage, it might be in meters cubed, or if you've got a really old one, it'll be in feet cubed. So it's just something to be aware of. If you are getting that data from meter readings, make sure you know what unit it's in, because you might have to convert it. So you might have to go from meters cubed or feet cubed to kilowatt hours. And there's little calculators on the website where you could, on the internet, sorry, where you can do that. You just type in like feet cubed to kilowatt hours conversion. So just one thing to watch out for there. So just on the greenhouse gas conversion figures, and we want, where are we? Fuels, we want burning oil, diesel, fuel oil, gas oil. We want natural gas. Where have you gone? There we are, natural gas. So we want it as kilowatt hours, and you got net and gross CV. So the CV is the calorific value. So just as a rule of thumb, I just include that just because it gives you a more accurate calculation. So again, it's total kilogram CO2e per unit. The kilowatt hour of natural gas with the gross calorific value is 0.18. So go back to here again. Are you still following me, even though I'm jumping around between different spreadsheets? So there to there, bam, there we go. Right, we've got materials and acquisition and production sorted now. So we're on to 14 kilograms so far, CO2e. Right. Any questions so far?
No. Great.
Cool. Lovely. Right, on to the next. So we're going to look at storage and distribution. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because there's not, to my knowledge, there isn't really any data available on this. So unless you knew what your storage warehouse were, like the size of your storage warehouse, there's no way of knowing what the kind of gas and electricity usage would be, unless you said, did you store it at home?
Yeah, storing at home, and also at the exhibition at the moment, making it exhibition. That's a storage. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, I mean, so I won't calculate it during this bit because I don't have the data available. So what you would do is you would calculate the total of the, like where it is at the moment, like where it is on the exhibition, like calculate the floor area of that, and then the area of what yours takes up, and then how long it's there for.
Crikey.
And then, yeah, it's really hard, isn't it? So what you could do is just, again, put it in your notes saying, actually, I'm not going to include that, or put any sort of figure in there saying, I know it's going to be roughly this. Yeah. And then, so for delivery to buyers, do you know where any of your buyers were? Like, just as a rough thing.
What do you mean? Who I sell to, where they live?
Yeah, do you know, because you'd have to do this on a per buyer basis as well, is the other thing.
Yeah, I mean, one recently has been London.
To London.
Yeah.
From
the others are local in Cornwall.
Okay. Well, actually, I'll show you where you can calculate that element. Because yeah, there's again, it's that thing. There's so many ifs and buts and maybes with that bit. So if we go to here, so there is a little one for deliveries. Where is it? Freighting goods. Here we go. So this again is the carbon footprint per so it's per ton kilometer, which is another really hard one. So it's basically transporting 1 ton of material 1 kilometer in these different kind of class of vehicle would be that number in carbon in CO2e. So again, if you know where it has been sent and you know the weight of the product that has been sent, then you can work it out from there. So we'll do really, really roughly again, we'll say that it was sent from let's say what's the postcode of Make Southwest?
I'd have to look it out.
It's TQ13.
One second. Where's my bloody browser gone? There we go. So TQ13.
Yeah, 9AF for Freddie.
9AF. Right. There we go. So I'll just share my screen again just so I can show you where I'm going with this. It's a bit like detective work in a way, isn't it? I think it's kind of cool. So we got that, and then we'll just put in London, even though I know London is massive and that is ridiculous, but we'll just put London, and then we can always refine it later on as we go on. So that's 208 miles. So we know that is 208 miles. We would then have to calculate 208 miles, 2 kilometers. So that's 334 kilometers. And let's say the finished product weighed 100 grams. So if 100 grams is 0.01 of a ton. No, it isn't. Oh God, what is it? No, it is. Yeah, 0.01 of a ton. Right. So we are very roughly assuming, again, very, very roughly assuming that we are transporting, so it's distribution, 0.0, transport from Make Southwest to London, and it will be 0.01, yeah, 0.1 tons per kilometer. And we know that we are going to be, hang on, that doesn't work, does it? No, it does, sorry. 0.01 tons per kilometer. We'll say we're going to send it in a class 3 van, because that seems about right. There we go. Very, very rough. 0.05 kilograms CO2e. You're still with me, everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Jamie, we've just had another question in the group chat from Julie. The wool in this example may have already a variable embedded carbon. For instance, the dyes used, the country it comes from originally, and its processing journey, the variable practices of sheep management that have impact on soil, etc. Can this be calculated?
You would have to ask the manufacturer whether they have calculated it. So yes, you definitely could, but it's not in the greenhouse gas conversion factors. So you would have to ask it of the manufacturers to see if they've calculated it. So this is the other thing that's that is a bit rough and ready with the calculation. But like, for example, here where I've put this scrap waste wool felt and threads, for example, being this carbon footprint equivalent, if you can make that more accurate, then take that line out and put your own data in, and then just in the notes, just kind of make a note saying, I got this from the manufacturer. So yeah, you'd have to ask them. Because it's not something that exists on the standard kind of calculation. If that makes sense.
Back a little bit to when you said it's unfair for this to be on the individual so much. With a lot of the things, especially if they're well, not even if they're just primary materials, but especially if they're primary materials, the onus really needs to be on the supplier to make those that data readily available. But obviously, that we're a way off that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very similar thing with waste as well. Like a lot of plastic waste, for example, kind of comes down the chain, and it always ends up with the end user having to deal with it. And I always think that that's supremely unfair, because you're like, well, it's not. I didn't ask for this. You know, I didn't ask for you to send me all of this rubbish that I then have to deal with. So yeah, it is an unfair practice. And you're absolutely right. Like, it's really hard to get that data. But then, yeah, as Emma's saying, you choose your suppliers. So in doing this carbon footprinting process, you might be like, hang on a minute, like this person's just, they've got no data available. There's no transparency. They're not helping. Like, then it might be time to think, well, you know, are they potentially the most sustainable option? Like, should I be looking elsewhere? Yeah. So all really good points. Right. So we have, oh, you know, I forgot to do well to tank again. I'm going to do it now because I keep forgetting. So, like I said, well to tank, that is the calculation of how many miles you've traveled by vehicle. So you kind of work it out as how, if you know the weight of the fuel or the amount of fuel that you've used, you can calculate it that way. But instead, what I'm going to do is just say, okay, it was a petrol mini car that traveled for 62 miles. So there's my conversion factor. And it's going to go back to my other spreadsheet here and then put in for travel well to tank 62 miles. So amount 62 miles of that. There we go. So that's the well to tank of the fuel. Cool. Right. Next bit. So we've done distribution, and then it's disposal. Then it's, again, what happens to it afterwards. So for scope 1 and 2, it depends on how you get rid of it. I mean, I'm assuming that you're not going to take it out and burn it. So I don't think there's going to be any scope 1 emissions there. And also there's going to be an element of guesswork in here as well, because once it's gone out of your control, you kind of have no way of knowing what people are going to do with it. So you have to sort of use your best judgment and best guess. So what I've assumed is that it's going to go to a closed loop recycling source. So what closed loop means is essentially, yeah, that there's if you think of waste management as it currently stands, it's very linear in its process. So that means you get new materials, you then process them into things, you create things, and then you chuck them away at the end. So that's very linear in its process. What we need to be moving to something called a circular economy or a closed loop, where instead at the end of a process, it gets remade back into new materials. So it goes like materials, product, and then waste kind of comes back around into new materials. So that's what it means by closed loop recycling source. It means it's going to come back into, be made into new things. So that's what we're going to assume. So there is a conversion factor for that as well. So we go back into our favorite spreadsheet in the whole wide world, and then go to its waste management, which is across the bottom, waste disposal. There we go. So we are going to say, and again, this is broken down, but like per type. So because it's like now we've made it into a composite material, it makes it even more difficult to know what the like where it's going to go, because it's now made of wood and plastic and thread and all of these kinds of things. So it makes it even more tricky to know kind of what waste stream it's going to go down to. So for ease and for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say clothing, just because it's kind of like the thread aspect. Or should I do plastic? Or should I do wood? You know, I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm going to go clothing, because for closed source, it's easier. So again, it's tracking in tons CO2e. Tons of material, and then the kilogram CO2e of dealing with that. So here it's got at the top here closed loop, which is recycling it, combustion, which is burning it, and then landfill, which is obviously sticking it in landfill. And there's a carbon dioxide equivalent with each of these things. So we're going to say it went to a closed loop source. And you'll see as well, the conversion factor is pretty much the same for all of these different materials anyway, because if you send it into closed loop recycling, that's kind of like they've just applied the same factor for all things. So we'll go back in and we'll say in the end, it weighed, where are we? Just here. So we've assumed that for transport, it weighed 0.1, which is like 100 grams. So we'll say it's the same again. So we'll say disposal. And then we'll say 100 grams to closed loop recycling, 0.1. And then that conversion factor. There we go. Done. Ish. But you see where the holes are.
Mm-hmm.
It's very rough. And that it always is. And it's super, super, super hard. And there's always a lot of kind of like if, buts, maybes, and slight kind of, just slight finger in the air guesses, total wild guesses sometimes. So yeah, this is where we've got it. It's 20 kilograms CO2e-ish with a heavy caveat. But you can kind of put, if you wanted to copy this template, you can, and just make notes and everything at the side here and just be like, I've calculated as this, but I had to because of this, and this. So when I calculate it again, I'm going to try and speak to the manufacturer and get a proper conversion factor from them rather than me making it up and saying it's clothing when I know it's not. Cool. Any questions? Oh.
So can I just ask you, Jamie, at 20, that's not great, is it?
No, that's fine. I mean, like,
where's our benchmark? Where are we sort of aiming at as makers? What do we? Obviously, I'm trying to do the best that I can within a circular economy, and looking at the waste and the end and all of that. But a lot from that calculation, it's all about my driving and the emissions through the gases that I'm using, and etc. And I know that when I do go and collect materials, or ideally scaffolding companies bring the netting here to the house to me, and that helps massively because it's their carbon footprint, not mine, isn't it?
Yeah.
So 20, not bad. And all the rest, all the materials are really good. They're all really low.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question, benchmarking, there isn't really one. I mean, there are benchmarks. So there's other conversion factors for like different products. I mean, like different finished products. So you could compare yourself to that in a way. But this is maybe something that Make Southwest could look into, is like a benchmarking system. So all of the different makers could like stack themselves up against each other and stack all their products up against each other. Because to my knowledge, one doesn't exist. And it's really difficult. So like at the moment, one of the things I'm working on is trying to calculate the carbon footprint of the audience travel for a urban event. So got all of everybody's postcodes, everybody's travel method, and then tried to stack that up against different other organizations in the city and how they get their audiences in. But there was no available data, there was no benchmark, so there was no way of knowing. Like, I came out with a figure which was, I think it was something like 25 kilograms CO2e per person per mile, but I was like, I don't know whether that's good or bad. And that's often that's another kind of pitfall with it, is like, unless you have something to compare it to, you're like, well, I don't know what this means. So you've got to kind of try and find something to compare yourself to. And then, the other thing, like you mentioned there, so with scaffolders bringing you netting, you're right, it's in their scope 1, but it would be in your scope 3. So you've got to make sure that and there is a lot of double counting and a lot of crossovers that goes on, because really, the only thing that if we were doing it absolutely perfectly, if everybody was perfectly reporting their carbon footprint, all everyone would have to do is just calculate their scope 1 effectively.
Yes.
Because then we know we've got the carbon footprint.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And it's very spotty.
And also, if there wasn't a benchmark, or if there is, it's like a traffic light system, whether you're more in the green or you're in the amber or the red, you know, that just helps you to direct where you need to make changes.
Absolutely. And this was what I was going to mention on my own, the next slide as well, is this is how you kind of, you come to the calculation, and then there's different ways you can do it. So you can have a range figure if you want and say there is an element of ambiguity in this calculation. So I know that the carbon footprint is going to be between this and this. So you can do it that way, which means then that you'll have to do multiple calculations, because you'll need to know what your bottom range is and what your top range is.
Top range, yeah.
You can do it that way, or I'm personally a fan of just choosing a single figure and just doing best guess, because ultimately it is, again, it goes back to what is this footprint for? Like, is it because you want to communicate this externally? You're like, I make sustainable products, and I know I do because I've calculated it. And then you can be like, well, okay, well, in that case, then I'm going to do a range because I want to be totally honest. Whereas if it's internal, it's like, I just want a bit of a finger in the air guess of where I roughly think I am, then just choose a single figure, which is what I usually do, because for me, carbon footprinting is about knowing where I'm supposed to be going and what I'm supposed to be spending all of my attention on. It doesn't really matter to me so much making it incredibly accurate, because it can't possibly be accurate, if that makes sense. It's really hard.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was very useful. Thank you.
No problem. So a couple of questions here. Closed loop recycling charity shop, absolutely, yeah, really good example. If you use materials that are rescued from waste, do I offset? So no, that would be getting your materials from, so on the materials use conversion factors, there is a specific bit, so materials use, where you get it from. So primary material production, whether it's reuse or whether it's from a closed loop source. So you'd have to get the correct, well, the closest possible what do you get, the closest possible material type to where you got it from. So was it reused or was it from a closed loop recycling source? So can't really think of it as an offset, because there is actually a carbon footprint associated with that. Polly, how I've used it. So do you mean how have I used this process before, or?
Not me.
Oh, it's Polly.
So no, I was just thinking about, because you've been using it so often, I was very interested in about how you were using it in your business, you know, in Leeds to support staff, companies, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, I'll show you one I've done, which I think, which shows you how far I've gone into it.
Excellent, that's fantastic. So it'd be good to know, because whilst we're dealing with what's happening in Southwest and individual makers, it's also really, for me, I'd be interested to see kind of how broad you have been dealing with it. Thank you.
No problem. So here we go. So this is one that I've calculated, and we are going into tons carbon dioxide equivalent here. So when I've calculated here, it's 38.77 tons CO2e. So we're talking much bigger scale. And this is for an installation that's going into Leeds as part of the Year of Culture this year. And it's basically by an artist called Mike Pinsky. And it's going to be 177 wooden fins standing up on end, and the idea behind this as well is that it's a sustainable installation, and once the installation is over, the wooden fins then go back into the supply chain. So it's supposed to be as pretty much zero carbon as you can get from doing large-scale public work, and even in doing that, the carbon footprint came out at 38 tons CO2e. And I did a bit of a kind of a pivot table on that. And again, it was all about travel and transport. It was all about getting materials from one place to another. So to kind of talk you through this bit of it, there's going to be a bit of electricity used during the installation for some LED lighting. So roughly calculated what I thought the energy usage would be. So I've said it's going to be 1.9 kilowatts total draw for 8 hours a day, and yada, yada, yada. Had to completely guess at how much metal was going to be in the installation. So I just said, a ton, just to roughly calculate it. And then we've got all of the other things, like they're buying some new LED lighting for it, and I've calculated that at 0.5 ton. So this is kind of all of the no, not 0.5 ton, sorry, 50 kilograms. So yeah, this is it's a lot more hardcore, this one. And yeah, like I said, we're talking in terms of tons CO2e rather than kilograms. But yeah, I have used it, and I've used this exact thing. So it's really good. It's this is where the kind of there are carbon calculators online, and they just say like, oh, type in a number and it will spit out another number back at you. There's no understanding of sort of what happens within that black box. You know, you put a number in and a number comes out and you're like, I don't know where this has come from. So it's why I always say it is time consuming and it is complicated, but this process really works once you get your head around it. Doing it manually, it's really good.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Amy, you asked if an electric vehicle was used to deliver to you, do you need to take into account the vehicle was charged, for example, with natural gas? So no, if it was delivered to you an electrical vehicle, like you only need to take into account really well to tank if it's your vehicle. If it's the delivery company's vehicle, it's fine. It's kind of already factored in. So you just need to compare. So say, okay, I know it was an electric van that transported this product from here to here. And the other thing as well is it's obviously unless you pay loads of money, they're not going to courier straight from one address to another. So when I did that thing earlier where I said, okay, it goes from Make Southwest to London, it's not going to do that. It's going to go to a distribution center, and then it's going to go from wherever to wherever. And it's probably going to go onto like a big truck and then come off a truck and all this kind of thing. So yeah, effectively you would just say, no, it went in an electric van from here to here, but just kind of make a note that actually that's probably not what happened. Yeah, it's very, very rough. So yeah, conversions have been designed for big businesses and manufacturing. So it is very complicated. You're absolutely right, Carolyn. And this is why I thought I'll show you the hardest possible way to do it. And the most accurate way to prove that actually even the most accurate way is kind of inaccurate. So it's very, very difficult, and it's up to you. It's whether you think that this is a process that's kind of worth doing in some ways, because it is tricky. So it's very yeah, it's hard. So if you're running a restaurant, could you calculate the carbon footprint of food? You absolutely can, yes. And I believe there might be a set of conversion factors specifically for food as well. I don't think they're on the Bayes ones, but they do exist. And it is horrifying. Especially for meat, the carbon footprint of meat is astonishingly high. But yeah, that you absolutely could do that. So the other thing that's quite good about doing it in this way is it's you can apply it to different things. Like you can say, okay, well, I want to, instead of just calculating the carbon footprint of a product, I want to calculate the carbon footprint of, like, I know, yeah, running a restaurant, and then you just plug different factors in. And yeah, it's very good in that way. Right, should we do the next one? Because it's an interesting one, is like wood specifically. Oh, someone got a question.
Oh no, just me saying yeah, let's do
it. Excellent. So
having said that, there is a question. Yeah.
Question. Is product durability a factor? It is for wood, yes. And it plays into what happens when you get rid of things. So I'll show you for wood why durability matters. And then because there's things like, there's this concept of embodied carbon. So there's carbon in things, and you can essentially think of like creating a product as a form of carbon capture and storage, which I'll come on to. Ceramics. That's an interesting one. I'll have to look on the greenhouse gas conversion factor to see whether ceramics have their own thing. They don't. Or do they? No, they don't. Yeah, ceramics don't seem to have their own greenhouse gas conversion factors, but effectively, if it's lasting a really long time, then that's great, because it just means that you can think of it as like you make a ceramic bowl, for example. If that is then lasting for 15 years, then that means that somebody doesn't have to then go out and buy another one, and then there's the embodied carbon in the new one. So by making something more durable and making it last longer, it is kind of indirectly cutting the carbon footprint of the world, because that doesn't have to be created again under like a short time frame. So like, for example, I've got a big bowl that I think it is actually a ceramic bowl that I inherited from my grandmother, and she got it from her mother who bought it in 1930 something. So that's been that's so durable. It's lasted for over 100 years, which is pretty cool. And benchmarking would be very, very useful in that way. So I throw down the gauntlet to you all to start doing all your calculations and working out your benchmarks. So the next one we're going to do, we've got a little bit of time, is a wooden chopping board. And now wood is a really, really interesting product when you think of like how it's processed and that kind of thing. So we've got here, it's made of ash. It should last a lifetime. If it's cared for properly, there's no reason why that shouldn't last a lifetime. So it's 45 by 28 by 3 centimeters, made of ash. So when we look at materials and acquisition, we have the scope 1 impact, which is the 2.4 miles to travel to a local timber yard and a medium diesel vehicle. So I'm going to assume that 2.4 miles is a single trip. So we'll need to times it by 2 to get our return, which is 4.8 miles. So 4.8 in medium diesel. Yeah. And then the interesting thing here is, so in scope 3, we've obviously got the welter tank of going and getting the material, but we've got the embodied carbon within the wood itself to think about. And this is not taken into account in the greenhouse gas conversion figures. This is kind of like an extra little thing that you can calculate if you wanted to. So Paul told me that the chopping board weighs 1.5 kilograms. So roughly, and again, it depends on the wood, typically speaking, about half of a wood, half of the weight of wood in its dried weight is carbon. So there's this idea of a biogenic carbon footprint. So essentially what this means is typically when you're thinking about carbon footprints, you are thinking about fossil fuel burning or like releasing sort of synthetic greenhouse gases in some way. Like you're thinking, okay, well, it's carbon that wouldn't have been emitted if it wasn't for humans. It's like kind of, we're burning fossil fuels or we're creating materials or whatever it is, and that's releasing carbon dioxide. Biogenic it's the carbon footprint of what would be released if you burn a kind of organic material. So it's the carbon that if you set fire to a kilogram of wood, half of that wood is carbon. So you'd be releasing that carbon from the wood. So as trees grow, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and during photosynthesis, they saw as this cellulose and lignin. So when you are using wood material to make materials, you can think of it sort of as carbon capture and storage, which is quite cool. So if you make, let's say, a table or a chair out of wood, and you expect that material is going to, or that object is going to last for, let's say, 15, 20 years, then that carbon is locked away in that object. It's not going anywhere. So as long as you got that wood from a sustainable source, like you got it from an FSC approved timber yard, you can think, well, they're going to be planting more trees to sequester more carbon. So as long as that process continues, then theoretically you've got a form of carbon capture and storage, which is quite cool. However, like it says here, the caveat is you really have to think carefully about what happens to the product, and is it sourced in a sustainable manner. So if you've gone and felled a tree for no good reason to make something out, to make an object out of it, which you're then going to be like, it lasts for 5 minutes and you burn it, that wasn't that's not a kind of a responsible use of that material. Whereas if you let's say you get it from an FSC approved source, wood as well, like trees, mature trees, so like especially trees that we cut down for softwood, so things like Douglas fir, it grows, and once it gets to a certain point, it doesn't sequester as much carbon anymore, so it's kind of sucked up all the carbon it's going to possibly suck up. So at that point, the best thing to do in some ways is to fell it, and then you can use that for let's say construction. So you could make wooden beams out of it, which you can then lock into a building for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then you can plant more trees to suck up more carbon.
It's currently partly cloud.
Go away, Siri. It's always trying to talk to me at the most inopportune moments. So does that make sense for CCS? Well, for carbon capture and storage, it's an interesting concept, but it's effectively think of wood as carbon that you can hold in a way. And if you're making products out of it and they last a long time, then theoretically you've got a way of storing carbon. It's very, very cool.
Yeah, that's like really interesting. I never kind of thought about that before.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of blew my mind a little bit when I first started learning about it. I was like, yeah, of course, that makes total sense. So with that in mind, just conscious that, yeah, we're getting towards the end-ish. So we've got, I'm just going to do it on the same calculator here, just so I don't have to like start a new one. So I'll just delete all these. Sorry, Joe. It's all right. We've got the recording. We'll calculate it again. So we did 2.4 miles to the local timber yard. So this is for travel, but we're saying it's 4.8 miles return. So travel to timber yard. And it's in a medium diesel vehicle. So that will be 4.8 miles return. And then we've got the travel, we've got the well to tank, and then we've got materials, and then we've got the biogenic, which I'll come to in a moment. So for this, I'm not going to share my screen because you'll know where to find it now. I've done it loads of times. So if I go to on the GHG conversion factors, I'm just looking for the passenger vehicles. Where's it gone? I've lost sight of it now. Where have you gone? What's the tank? Managed, it's not managed assets. Oh God, I've lost it. This is good, isn't it? Anyway, let's just go for this. It's we can always make it more accurate later on. So that's the unit. Oh, sorry, no, that's not the unit, that's miles. And then we've got the conversion factor there. So we've got the well to tank to think about as well. So we'll just do that, which is passenger vehicles, well to tank. So in diesel, it's this one. And we know it's 4.8 miles. Right, the biogenic. This is where it gets fun. So key will be the same to apparently 50% carbon. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. I'll have to see if there's a wool biogenic footprint. What have I done there? Oh, nothing. That's really interesting. What about composting as end use? Good question. That's what we're going to look at on the biogenic carbon calculator. So this is a carbon calculator from the WWF. They released it in 2020 during lockdown. So it's there's a basic and an advanced, but we're just going to do the basic because yeah, we've only got 25 minutes. So the first question is the amount of biogenic carbon contained in the product. So Paul told me that the carbon, the weight of the chopping board is 1.5 kilograms, and we're going to assume that 0.75 of it is carbon, so it's half. However, like different tree types have different amount of carbon locked in them, but as a rough rule of thumb, it says that the generic carbon content of wood is about 50%. So I've said 0.75. Biogenic carbon, hang on. No, I do mean 0.75. There we go. So amount of years the biogenic carbon is stored. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the default years at this point, and then you can choose the lifespan category here. So you've got energy for combustion, you've got building materials, other building materials, so like plywood, veneer, whatever, structural support materials, furnishing, packing materials, long life paper. So I'm going to go furnishing because that's roughly right. So essentially what we're saying here is that 0.75 kilograms of carbon is going to be locked away for 16 years in this chopping board, provided that nothing bad happens to it. So we're going to allow for the forest growth retime. The biomass origin, it's not tropical, it's coming from have we got ash on here? Not Douglas fir, pine, spruce. Anybody know much about wood? Does anybody know whether ash would be close to any of these? Otherwise, I'm just going to choose spruce because it sounds about right. No, we'll just go for spruce. It's going to be roughly right. So 100% of it comes from spruce. So here we've got
a consensus of beech.
A consensus of beech. Okay, very good. I love how this tree experts is brilliant. Go for beech. There we go. So here we go. So the biogenic carbon calculator is one, but it's really weird way that it writes this down, but it's 1.87 to the exponent plus 0. But it basically means the biogenic carbon calculator is 1 kilogram carbon dioxide, 1.87 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent. 1.87 kilograms. That can't be right, can it? How can it end up with more than it had originally? So there's something not quite right here. It's not calculated it properly. Why has it done that? That can't be right. Hang on. 2.21. Why have you done that? Okay, I think the calculator's broken, so that's good, isn't it? Temperature, CO2 emissions and removal. Somehow it's saying that you end up with more carbon in... Okay, for some reason the calculator is broken, or I'm reading it wrong. So this is good. You know, this is why you do it beforehand rather than trying to do it live. But it does really work on the bigger ones. So I wonder if it's just because we're using a smaller amount that it's just having a bit of a... It's entering row 73 twice. Oh, is that what I did? Row 73 twice. No, that's a calculation that it's doing.
On row 69, your calculation is putting in row 73 twice. It's adding it to row 74 and again.
Oh no, that's an if statement, isn't it? It's saying if it's that, then add those together. Otherwise,
Okay.
don't. Yeah, I don't know why it's done that. That's very odd. How could it possibly be higher? But anyway, so what we'll do instead, because the calculator is broken, I'll have to find out why that is. But there is, on the greenhouse gas conversion figures, again, there is a number on... Where are you? So again, on materials use. There we go, material use. There's another one here for, and I think it's just bog standard wood, which is a bit annoying, because that one's better. And so the idea behind the biogenic carbon calculator, if it works, and I will implore to find out why that's not working properly, but effectively, you were asking there, who was asking there? So Jane, when you were asking there, what about compost as an end use? Because compost, obviously, that breaks down in the soil over time. So wood would break down and release carbon dioxide. So the best thing you can possibly do with wood is lock it into a building. So like I said, lock it into, well, obviously leave forests alone if they don't need to be cut down, just leave them to do their thing. But if you are going to do it, making it into wooden planks for installing into a building, that's going to be lock it away for the longest possible time. Then you've got things like using it for furniture, so locking it away for like 16 plus years. And then you've got things like making it in paper products. Then you've got things like putting it on gardens into compost. And then finally you've got putting it into landfill or burning it. So yeah, it would the amount of carbon that could be theoretically released would change over these different time periods. So if I go back to the one that I've already done, because it did work for that one, 2 ticks. Because like I said, this is the idea behind this whole making a stand thing that we're doing with Mike Binsky. The whole point is that we're not supposed. The installation could be thought of as part of the supply chain. So what I've done is assume that 25% of the timber is going to be going to construction. So that has a negative carbon footprint of -3 tons CO2e in this instance, because the timber is going to be locked away into a building, and then new trees are going to be planted to grow and sequester more carbon. So because that tree, that wood has been locked away in a building for a certain amount of time, those new trees that have replaced that original one are now sucking up more carbon, and they've been left alone for 20 or plus years, so they're going to be sucking up more carbon. And then I've got like timber to community projects making into furnishings, then I've got timber to compost, and then timber to biomass. And this again was for this particular production, it was just trying to guess like what might happen to the wood after the project, because the intention is all of it goes to construction, but that might not happen. So that's why I've put in like, okay, we'll assume 25% goes here, 25% goes here, and then calculate the biogenic carbon footprint from that when the calculation worked, which is not super helpful. So what I'll just quickly do, just because I want to leave some time for questions, and I think, yeah, if you wanted to calculate the carbon footprint of this, I think you've got all the kind of tools now. So we've got, like I said, the materials and acquisition, and they calculate the biogenic carbon footprint. There's the scope 1. Paul didn't tell me about any gas they was using, but there was the scope 2 usage for electricity, so I've calculated that in there. And the other element as well that I didn't go over, I thought there was a bit on, no, it's not there. Sorry, the one thing that I did want to mention is around benchmarks, and I was going to do that here. So that is, if you don't have a kind of specific number that you can work to calculate, you can use a benchmark. So there's these things, I'll send you a link to this as well. It's the TM46 guidelines from CIBSE. So CIBSE are a what do you call them? They basically do like a lot of stuff for the construction industry, and they do a lot of like carbon benchmarking, and they do like recommendations for how you can make buildings more sustainable. But they have here, like, if you literally don't have any other information, you can get a benchmark. So if we go to, for example, there is one for workshop. So here we go. Number 27, we have a benchmark for a workshop, and it's supposed to give like a brief description, and it goes workshop, which is not really helpful. But essentially, these two numbers here, 35 and 180, 35 is the typical electricity benchmark in kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, which is again a bit funky. But effectively what it's saying is, if you have no other data to go on, you're like, I want to work out the carbon footprint of my workshop, I can say, well, I know that my workshop is, let's say, 800 square meters. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, well, this is 800 square meters times by this number. So 800 times 35 will give you a typical electricity usage benchmark for your workshop. But again, it is very, very quick and dirty and not accurate at all. But it's like, if you've got nothing else, then you've got that benchmark document, and I'll send you that afterwards. Does that make sense? It's kind of like your absolute last resort. If you've got nothing else, you're like, well, I'm just going to have to use the benchmark because I've got no other information. Cool. Theatre tech. Yeah, Melanie, absolutely will, of course. Cool. Right, moving on to the last few things. So, like I said, yeah, for production, we've only got that electricity usage. I'm not going to calculate at this point because you know how to do it by now. Similar for the kind of distribution impacts. You got the gas used during the storage, electricity used during the storage and delivery to buyers. You could use the CIBSE guidance if I think there's like distribution storage warehouse or something. So again, you would work out the total square footage of the storage warehouse and how much this one element takes up in it, and then how long it's there for, to give you a carbon footprint. Again, quick and dirty and not super accurate. And then for disposal for the wood, again, that scope 3, that disposal element, it depends on what the buyer does with it. Because if they look after it and it lasts for 70 odd years, then you could think, well, the carbon footprint would be in the negative territory because it's basically stored carbon for that amount of time. But if they just get it and like, oh, cool chopping board and set fire to it, I'm not saying why, I don't know why anyone would do that. But then that's obviously released the carbon dioxide. So again, you have to kind of do best guess on what you expect people will do with it. And then try and calculate it from that. So last couple of little things. So other carbon calculators that are out there, and like I said, these are kind of these black box calculators where they don't show they're working in a lot of cases. You just put a number in, it spits a number out, and you're like, well, it's not, okay. it's not great in my opinion. So this might be a useful one for you, Elaine, is the Creative Green tools, which is specifically for live events and for buildings-based organizations. So it's a free carbon calculator, but it is for theaters, music venues, festivals, that kind of thing. Again, with this, you're talking in terms of tons carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's kind of for the big players, really. There's the WWF carbon calculator. This is for roughly calculating the carbon footprint of your personal life. It's not accurate, again, because it can't be, because you basically enter in I eat meat occasionally, and it goes, okay, well, here's your carbon footprint then, and there's no nuance there. There's no, it's not super, but it's very good for kind of quick and dirty calculations. And then there's the Carbon Trust calculator as well, which is probably the closest one that's useful to you. And this is for small medium enterprises to calculate the carbon footprint of their operations. So again, this is free. But I honestly would say that it is no substitute from doing it yourself, because if you do try and do it yourself, you'll quickly find out where the pitfalls are, where you have to make assumptions, where your biggest impacts are, and all this kind of thing. So, any questions? I hope that was okay. And it's a very complicated picture, and it is with a lot, like I say, with a lot of ifs, buts, maybes, a lot of maths, and a lot of making stuff up on occasions. But I really hope that was useful.
Yeah, that was really incredible, Jamie. You've got so much knowledge in your head. But even just having, I think, the links that you've provided to the calculation, but also to where you can find out some of this information, that's the start point for a lot of people. You just kind of go, where do I find it, or how do I know how much carbon is being being expelled from X, Y, or Z? And I think, like you say, there's two things really that our makers should kind of think about: what they're doing the carbon footprint for. So yeah, if it's just for your own self, which I would really encourage people to do it for, then it is just helpful to know, actually, I don't know enough information about where my wood comes from, or where my cobalt comes from, and then that maybe sparks off. So okay, you might not be able to come up with an accurate carbon calculation right now. You might not even be able to do part of the carbon calculation at all, but it starts you actually having a serious think about what suppliers you're using and whether they can provide you with that information. But yeah, sorry, I will open it up to questions if people want to unmute themselves and ask, or just pop it in the chat to everyone. Then that's great. I'll shut up. Yeah, lots of good feedback coming through. Right, well, I don't think there's any more questions.
Yeah, stunned silence, I think. Oh, tools and equipment. That is a good one. So there again isn't really a greenhouse gas conversion figure for that. So they've got, I think, managed assets. It's something like WEEE equipment, which is it's basically small electronic items, and that's kind of all they've got. So again, that would be worth, if you want to kind of dig into it, you could maybe get in touch with the suppliers and the manufacturers and see if they've calculated the carbon footprint of those products. or you kind of say, okay, well, I'm not going to include that in my calculation because I don't know it, but what I will include is me going to get the tools and equipment, which, yeah, I wouldn't recommend. I would try and include something if you can, or like, I mean, for like a hammer or something as well, you could say, okay, well, I know that it weighs about this much and it's made of metal, so I'd say it's roughly this. Kilns. I don't know. I mean, what are they made from? Are they made from brick? So, well, I guess some of them are. I think someone else would have to, someone who's an expert on kilns would have to answer this one. Like, I'm not yeah, metal and brick. So, well, yeah, you could do it for the weight, because there are on the conversion factors, there is, under the materials use, there is a carbon footprint associated with both brick and with metal as construction tools. So you could do it that way. Or you could get in touch with your kiln person and see if they've calculated it. It's a very it's a really good question.
Yeah, I think as well, though, it kind of comes back to what you're what you're measuring for and why you're measuring it. If you know that you're going to use a kiln on your work because your work is firing ceramics, then that's not necessarily going to change. And knowing the carbon footprint of the actual materials that built your kiln isn't necessarily useful. Whereas knowing and being able to measure the carbon footprint of like the materials that you're using again and again, so i.e. the clay, and yeah, the carbon emissions of the energy and stuff you're using, that's more useful because that's something that you can do something about. So you can change that. You know, get a different supplier, or, you know, when a grant becomes available, get solar panels, and, you know, all that stuff. So it's just, yeah, it's what you kind of, why you want to measure it, I think.
Absolutely. And there's a couple of other things, actually, both Emma and Tony, I think you're asking sort of similar questions in some ways. It's what are the main impacts that you should be focusing on? So it's how you want to frame that. Because if you think, okay, I'm going to talk purely in terms of carbon, if you want to talk purely in terms of carbon, then yeah, your biggest impact would probably be transport across all of your three scopes. And it's also the thing you have the most control over. So, you know, you can be like, well, I am not going to drive to go and get this material. You know, I'm not going to do a 62-mile round trip, for example. I'm going to just get it from a different supplier who's closer. However, there's the other thing to consider, and I think this is actually, it's quite an important one that often gets overlooked, is when you think about sustainability, it goes beyond environmental sustainability, because there's also economic and social sustainability as well. So, for example, if you, let's say you buy some sustainable yarn or reusable yarn from Amazon, then that money that you've spent on that thing, it goes to Jeff Bezos so he can buy his next yacht. And, you know, it's just gone. That money, it goes out of the local economy. So if you think of it being like, okay, well, I'm going to spend money, but I want to keep the money here, then you could focus on perhaps looking at it not just in a purely carbon sense, but looking in more of an economic and social sustainability sense, saying what I want to do is I want to keep the money here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy from a local supplier. I'm going to stimulate my local economy. And Amazon doesn't, yeah, oh, it does, but it does pay poverty wages. So like, I don't know, like, it's a whole other thing. But you're right. I mean, it does kind of employ the local economy. It does employ local people, but the profit doesn't really stay here. It's gone. Like, it goes to kind of not paying corporation tax and all this kind of thing. So yeah, maybe Amazon was a bad example, but you know, that's another way of kind of looking at it, is look at it beyond carbon and look at things. Okay, well, yeah, in terms of my carbon impact, transport is going to be my biggest thing, but actually I want to have a social and economic impact as well. So I'm going to spend locally. I'm going to buy from local suppliers. That's another way of looking at it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
You could do a whole nother session on Amazon though, couldn't you?
Oh, I could indeed. I could talk all of your ears off about it. I've got some very strong opinions.
Right, any more for any more, or
There was one that actually Emma did ask for my top 3 and I only gave 2. So there's travel and transport, stimulating the local economy, I'd probably say, and but materials usage and longevity, trying to make things last, because there's this idea of the waste pyramid, and one thing that people often jump to, and I've been guilty of it myself as well, is saying this material is recyclable, so therefore it's great. Like, brilliant, this material is recyclable, therefore fantastic. But there's 3 or 4 steps before you even get to recycling. So like at the very top of the pyramid is refuse. Like, if you don't need that material, don't get it in the first place. That's the most sustainable thing you can do, is don't have it. The second most sustainable is reduce, like basically have less of it. And then you've got reuse. So reuse materials into different things. Oh no, sorry, it's repurpose is the next one. So make that thing that you've bought into another thing. So for example, making yogurt pots into plant pots, for example. That's like repurposing an object from one thing into another. Then you've got reuse. So like at the end of its life, reuse it and make it into, use it for something else. And then you've got recycling at the very bottom of the pyramid. So when you're thinking about longevity of products, it's that kind of making it last for a really long time, and then making it so that it could potentially be used or made into something else at the end of its life. So sorry, that was really a bit waffly, but effectively, I'd say concentrate on like materials and their longevity and what you're actually going to do with them once the product has been created, and that kind of thing. Make it so that it's easy to make it into other things. That's what I'd say. Those are my top 3.